Ma'am, whose vehicle is this?
It's mine. I live here. This is my home.
And what exactly are you doing in this neighborhood?
I just returned from work. I'm a judge.
Ma'am?
A judge? Right.
I'm recording this.
Put the phone away now.
It was supposed to be a quiet Tuesday evening, the kind of evening where you come home from work, pull into your own garage, and forget about the stress of the day. But for one woman, that simple act of arriving home would trigger a chain of events so shocking, so outrageous, that it would end careers, destroy lives, and expose a pattern of racism that had been hiding in plain sight for years. Before we dive into this incredible story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button, because what unfolds next will leave you absolutely speechless. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this story develops. The woman at the center of this storm was Judge Diane Crawford, a 52-year-old federal judge who had dedicated her entire career to upholding justice and protecting constitutional rights. She lived in an upscale neighborhood in the suburbs, the kind of place where people knew their neighbors and children rode bicycles on tree-lined streets. Judge Crawford had moved there 3 years earlier after her appointment to the federal bench, choosing the quiet community specifically because she wanted peace and privacy after long days in the courthouse. That Tuesday evening in late September, Judge Crawford was returning home from a particularly challenging day. She had presided over a complex civil rights case, reviewed dozens of legal briefs, and attended a judicial conference that ran late into the evening. All she wanted was to get inside her house, pour herself a glass of wine, and catch up on some reading before bed. She had no idea that her life was about to change forever. As she turned onto her street just after 8 p.m., Judge Crawford noticed something unusual. 2 police cruisers were parked near the corner, which was odd because this neighborhood rarely saw any police presence. She thought perhaps there had been a break-in or some minor incident, but she didn't give it much more consideration. She simply wanted to get home. Judge Crawford pulled into her driveway and pressed the garage door opener. The familiar mechanical whir filled the evening air as the door slowly lifted. She had performed this exact routine hundreds of times before. Pull into the driveway, wait for the garage to open, drive inside, close the door, and enter her house through the connecting door. Simple, routine, completely normal. But as she began to drive into her garage, she noticed movement in her rearview mirror. The 2 police cruisers had suddenly come to life, their headlights cutting through the growing darkness as they drove quickly down the street toward her house. Her first thought was that perhaps they were responding to an emergency call nearby. She continued into her garage, expecting them to drive past. They didn't drive past. Instead, both vehicles turned sharply into her driveway, blocking her exit. The garage door was still open, and Judge Crawford found herself trapped inside her own garage with 2 police cars positioned behind her. Red and blue lights began flashing, casting eerie shadows on the walls of her garage. This was when she knew something was terribly wrong. Officer Derek Hansen stepped out of the first cruiser. He was a 15-year veteran of the force, with a reputation for being aggressive and quick to escalate situations. His partner, Officer Ryan Mitchell, emerged from the passenger side. Both men were white, both appeared agitated, and both seemed to have already made up their minds about what they were dealing with before they had even spoken to Judge Crawford. From the second cruiser came Officer Brad Coleman and his rookie partner, Officer Steve Walsh. Coleman had been on the force for 8 years and had developed what his colleagues euphemistically called a proactive approach to policing. Walsh was fresh out of the academy, eager to prove himself, and unfortunately about to learn the wrong lessons from the wrong officers. Judge Crawford remained in her car, unsure of what was happening. Through her side mirror, she could see the officers approaching her vehicle. Officer Hansen walked directly to her driver's side window and tapped on it with his flashlight, even though the garage was well lit and there was no need for additional illumination. She rolled down her window and calmly asked what the problem was. Hansen immediately demanded to see her identification. When Judge Crawford asked why she was being stopped, Hansen's response was both telling and legally problematic. He said they had received reports of suspicious activity in the neighborhood and needed to verify who she was and what she was doing there. Judge Crawford, with her extensive legal background, immediately recognized several issues with this explanation. First, she was clearly entering her own garage, attached to her own house. Second, no specific criminal activity had been alleged. Third, the officers had provided no reasonable, articulable suspicion that would justify a stop under the Fourth Amendment. But she also knew that challenging police officers in the heat of the moment could escalate a situation unnecessarily. She reached for her purse to retrieve her driver's license, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid any misunderstandings. As she handed Hansen her identification, she politely but firmly asked again what this was about. Hansen barely glanced at the license before asking her what she was doing in this neighborhood. The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. What was she doing in this neighborhood? She lived here. This was her house, her garage, her driveway. The implication was clear and insulting. In Hansen's mind, a black woman did not belong in this upscale, predominantly white neighborhood, regardless of her obvious means to afford living there, or the fact that she was clearly entering her own home. Judge Crawford felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. She had experienced racism throughout her career, subtle and not so subtle instances where her qualifications were questioned, her authority undermined, or her presence in professional spaces treated as somehow inappropriate. But this felt different. This was happening at her own home, in her own garage, by officers who were supposed to serve and protect all citizens equally. She answered Hansen's question with remarkable composure. She told him that she lived in this house, that this was her garage, and that she was simply coming home from work. Hansen looked skeptical, as if the very idea of a black woman owning property in this neighborhood was inherently suspicious. Officer Mitchell, Hansen's partner, walked around to the passenger side of Judge Crawford's car and peered inside, using his flashlight to examine the interior. He asked her to step out of the vehicle. Judge Crawford asked why this was necessary, pointing out that she had provided identification and explained that she was at her own home. Hansen's response revealed the true nature of what was happening. He said that they needed to verify her story because there had been break-ins in the area recently, and her presence here late at night fit the profile of someone who might be casing houses for future burglaries. Let me pause here for a moment. Have you ever experienced or witnessed something like this? Type yes in the comments if you have, because what happened next would test every ounce of Judge Crawford's legal training and personal restraint. The profile Hansen mentioned was particularly offensive because it was so obviously based on nothing more than Judge Crawford's race. She was well-dressed, driving a luxury sedan, entering a garage with an electronic opener, and clearly belonged in the neighborhood. The only thing that made her fit any profile was the color of her skin. Judge Crawford stepped out of her car, knowing that cooperation was her best strategy for de-escalating the situation, even though every fiber of her being wanted to assert her rights and demand that these officers leave her property immediately. She was acutely aware that as a federal judge, any incident involving law enforcement could become a matter of public record and potentially impact her career. Officer Coleman joined the group, making the situation even more intimidating. 3 armed officers were now surrounding Judge Crawford in her own garage, treating her like a criminal suspect rather than a homeowner who had just arrived home from work. The 4th officer, Walsh, remained by the police cars, presumably to call for backup if needed. Hansen asked Judge Crawford if she had any weapons in the car. She replied that she did not. He asked if she would consent to a search of her vehicle. This request was particularly galling because it demonstrated just how far these officers were willing to go based on absolutely no legitimate suspicion of criminal activity. Judge Crawford politely declined to consent to a search, explaining that she had committed no crime and there was no reasonable basis for such a request. Hansen's expression darkened. He clearly wasn't used to people asserting their constitutional rights, particularly black people in situations like this. Mitchell suggested that they should call for additional units, claiming that Judge Crawford was being uncooperative. The irony was staggering. A federal judge, standing in her own garage, being accused of uncooperativeness for declining to waive her Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable searches. What happened next would transform this from a case of racial profiling into something far more serious. with consequences that would reverberate through the entire police department and ultimately cost multiple officers their careers. But the officers had no idea who they were dealing with, and Judge Crawford was about to make a decision that would change everything. The tension in that garage was reaching a breaking point, and neither side was backing down. What these officers didn't realize was that they had just made the worst mistake of their professional lives, targeting someone who not only understood the law better than they did, but who had the power and knowledge to ensure that justice would be served. That justice would be served. Judge Crawford made a decision that would prove to be absolutely brilliant. She pulled out her cell phone and began recording. She didn't hide it or try to be sneaky about it. She held the phone up clearly, making sure the camera captured all 4 officers and the entire interaction. The moment that camera came out, everything changed. Officer Hansen immediately demanded that she stop recording. Judge Crawford calmly explained that she had every legal right to record police officers performing their duties in a public space. Hansen stepped closer, his voice rising as he ordered her to put the phone away. She did not comply. She kept recording, her voice steady and professional as she narrated what was happening. This is when the officers made their second catastrophic mistake. Instead of recognizing that they had overstepped and backing away from the situation, they doubled down. Coleman moved to block the camera angle, while Mitchell positioned himself near Judge Crawford's car as if preparing to search it anyway. Judge Crawford spoke directly into the camera, clearly stating the date, time, and location. She identified herself only as a homeowner who was being detained without cause in her own garage. She described each officer's actions and their badge numbers, which were clearly visible on their uniforms. Her legal training was evident in how methodically she documented everything. Hansen grew increasingly agitated by her calm, professional demeanor. He seemed to expect fear or submission, but instead faced someone who understood her rights better than he understood his own authority. He threatened to arrest her for obstruction of justice. Judge Crawford asked him to specify exactly what justice she was obstructing by standing in her own garage and exercising her constitutional rights. The question hung in the air because Hansen had no good answer. There was no investigation being obstructed, no crime being prevented, no legitimate law enforcement purpose being served. They were simply harassing a black woman for having the audacity to exist in an upscale neighborhood. Officer Walsh, the rookie, looked increasingly uncomfortable as the situation escalated. Later testimony would reveal that he had tried to suggest they should leave, but the senior officers ignored him. This was supposed to be a learning experience for the new officer, but he was learning all the wrong lessons about policing. Mitchell made the third devastating mistake of the evening. He reached for Judge Crawford's phone, attempting to grab it from her hands. She clearly stated that he was trying to destroy evidence and that she did not consent to being touched or having her property seized. The entire exchange was captured on video as Mitchell's hand made contact with both the phone and Judge Crawford's arm. What happened next would become the focal point of multiple investigations and lawsuits. Hansen announced that Judge Crawford was under arrest for resisting arrest. The circular logic was stunning. She was being arrested for resisting an arrest that had no legal basis in the first place. It was like something out of a dystopian novel, except it was happening in real life in an American garage. As Hansen moved to handcuff Judge Crawford, she made one final attempt to resolve the situation peacefully. She told the officers that she was a federal judge, thinking that this revelation might bring some sanity to the proceedings. She was wrong. Hansen accused her of lying and impersonating a federal official, adding another charge to his growing list of false accusations. Judge Crawford was handcuffed in her own garage, while her cell phone continued recording from where it had fallen when Mitchell grabbed it. The video captured her being led past her own car, through her own garage, and placed in the back of a police cruiser. The absurdity of the situation was breathtaking. But the officers weren't finished. Coleman decided they needed to search Judge Crawford's house for evidence of the break-ins they claimed to be investigating. This decision would prove to be their final and most costly mistake. Without a warrant, without consent, and without any exigent circumstances, they began attempting to enter Judge Crawford's home. The house alarm system activated when they tried to open the connecting door from the garage. The piercing sound echoed through the neighborhood, waking residents and drawing attention to what was happening. Several neighbors came outside to see what was causing the commotion. Some began recording with their own phones. One neighbor, an elderly white woman named Mrs. Patterson, who had lived on the street for 30 years, approached the scene. She knew Judge Crawford well and had nothing but respect for her. When she saw Judge Crawford handcuffed in the police car, she immediately began asking the officers what was happening. Hanson told Mrs. Patterson to mind her own business and return to her house. When she persisted in asking questions, he threatened to arrest her for interfering with a police investigation. This threat against a prominent community member who was clearly just concerned about her neighbor would later become another piece of evidence in the pattern of misconduct. Mrs. Patterson was not easily intimidated. She had been a civil rights lawyer before retiring and knew exactly what she was witnessing. She began documenting everything, taking photos of the officers' badge numbers and license plates. She also called 911 to report what appeared to be police harassment of her neighbor. The 911 call created an interesting situation. The dispatcher had to figure out how to respond to a report of police misconduct that was supposedly being committed by officers who were already on scene. Eventually, a supervisor was contacted and told to respond to Judge Crawford's address immediately. Meanwhile, the officers continued their unlawful search of Judge Crawford's property. They found nothing suspicious because there was nothing suspicious to find. Judge Crawford's house was immaculately maintained, filled with legal books, judicial awards, and evidence of a distinguished career in public service. But by now, the officers were too invested in their narrative to admit they had made a mistake. Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez arrived as the supervising officer and immediately recognized that something was seriously wrong. She found Judge Crawford still handcuffed in the police car and 4 officers who couldn't provide a coherent explanation for why they had arrested a homeowner in her own garage. When Rodriguez reviewed Judge Crawford's identification and realized she actually was a federal judge, her face went pale. Rodriguez immediately ordered Judge Crawford to be uncuffed and released. She then had a heated discussion with Hanson and the other officers away from the recording devices. What she told them in that private conversation was never officially documented, but witnesses reported hearing raised voices and what sounded like a supervisor delivering a severe reprimand. Judge Crawford was finally free, but the damage was done. She had been handcuffed and arrested in her own home without cause. Her property had been illegally searched. She had been treated like a criminal by officers who were supposed to protect and serve her, and all of it had been captured on multiple video recordings that would soon change everything. The immediate aftermath was almost as telling as the incident itself. Hanson attempted to write a police report that would justify their actions, claiming that Judge Crawford had been acting suspiciously and had resisted their investigation. His report made no mention of the fact that she was in her own garage, or that she had immediately identified herself as the homeowner. Mitchell and Coleman supported Hanson's version of events in their reports, creating what appeared to be a coordinated attempt to cover up their misconduct. Only Walsh, the rookie officer, expressed reservations about the narrative being constructed. His honest account would later prove crucial in unraveling the lies his colleagues had told. Judge Crawford spent that night documenting everything that had happened. She reviewed the video recordings, wrote a detailed timeline of events, and began researching the legal options available to her. As a federal judge, she had seen countless cases of police misconduct, but experiencing it firsthand gave her a new perspective on the trauma and humiliation that victims endured. The next morning, Judge Crawford made several phone calls that would set in motion a series of events that none of the officers involved could have imagined. She contacted the FBI's Civil Rights Division, the local U.S. Attorney's Office, and the Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. She also reached out to several civil rights organizations and journalists who specialized in covering police misconduct. Quick question for everyone watching. Do you think the officers realized how much trouble they were in at this point? Type your thoughts in the comments. The story broke 2 days later when a local news station obtained copies of the video recordings. The footage was damning. It showed 4 white police officers harassing a black woman in her own garage, arresting her without cause, and attempting to search her home without a warrant. The optics were terrible, but the legal implications were even worse. The police department initially tried to defend the officers' actions, releasing a statement that claimed they had been responding to reports of suspicious activity and had followed proper procedures. This narrative collapsed within hours when multiple witnesses came forward to contradict the official version of events. Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who had witnessed everything, gave a television interview that destroyed the police department's credibility. She explained that there had been no recent break-ins in the neighborhood and no reports of suspicious activity. She also revealed that she had seen the officers sitting in their cars for over an hour before they decided to target Judge Crawford, suggesting that the stop was premeditated rather than responsive. The revelation that Judge Crawford was a federal judge added another layer of complexity to the story. Legal experts began analyzing the incident on television, explaining how every action taken by the officers had violated clearly established constitutional rights. The fact that they had targeted a sitting federal judge made the misconduct even more egregious and ensured that the case would receive national attention. By the end of the week, the story had gone viral on social media. The hashtag Justice for Judge Crawford began trending as people shared the video and expressed their outrage. Civil rights organizations called for immediate action against the officers involved. Legal scholars wrote opinion pieces about the broader implications of police officers targeting members of the judiciary. The officers involved had no idea that their decision to profile and harass Judge Crawford would ultimately expose a pattern of misconduct that had been hidden for years. Internal Affairs began investigating not just the incident itself, but the officers' entire history of interactions with minority citizens. What they found would shock even seasoned investigators and lead to consequences that would reverberate through the entire department. Hanson's personnel file revealed a disturbing pattern that somehow had been overlooked or ignored by his supervisors. He had received numerous complaints over the years, almost all from Black and Hispanic citizens who alleged they had been stopped, searched, or detained without cause. The complaints had been routinely dismissed or resulted in minimal discipline, allowing Hanson to continue his pattern of behavior unchecked. One particular complaint stood out among the dozens in Hanson's file. 3 years earlier, a Black attorney named David Washington had filed a detailed report alleging that Hanson had pulled him over for no apparent reason while he was driving through the same upscale neighborhood where Judge Crawford lived. Washington claimed that Hanson had searched his car, questioned his right to be in the area, and made several racially charged comments during the encounter. The complaint had been investigated by Hanson's direct supervisor at the time, Lieutenant Mark Stevens, who concluded that Washington's allegations were unsubstantiated. Stevens had accepted Hanson's explanation that he had stopped the attorney for a minor traffic violation and that Washington had been uncooperative and hostile. No disciplinary action was taken, and Hanson received nothing more than a verbal counseling session. But now, with Judge Crawford's incident under federal investigation, Washington's complaint was being re-examined with fresh eyes. Investigators discovered that Stevens had never interviewed the witnesses that Washington had provided. He had never requested dashcam footage from Hanson's patrol car. He had never even visited the location where the stop allegedly occurred to verify Hanson's version of events. The pattern became clearer as investigators dug deeper. Mitchell's file contained similar red flags. He had been the subject of 6 formal complaints in 8 years of service, all involving allegations of excessive force or discriminatory treatment. Like Hanson, he had managed to avoid serious consequences because supervisors had consistently given him the benefit of the doubt when his word was pitted against that of minority complainants. Coleman's record was perhaps the most disturbing of all. Despite having only 8 years on the force, he had accumulated more complaints than officers with twice his experience. Several involved allegations that he had used racial slurs during arrests or traffic stops. One particularly damning incident involved a Black teenager who claimed Coleman had planted evidence during a drug search. The teenager's mother had tried to pursue the matter through official channels, but her complaints had been dismissed when Coleman and his partner provided contradicting testimony. No one had thought to check whether Coleman had a pattern of such behavior because the complaints were handled individually without anyone looking for broader trends. Internal affairs investigators also discovered something that would prove to be explosive evidence in the federal case against the officers. The police department's computer system automatically logged every time officers ran license plates or checked identification through their patrol car terminals. A review of Hansen's activity logs revealed a shocking pattern of behavior. Over the past 2 years, Hansen had run license plate checks on vehicles parked in upscale neighborhoods at a rate far exceeding any legitimate law enforcement purpose. The vast majority of these checks occurred during evening hours when residents were likely to be arriving home from work. Most telling of all, the vehicles he targeted belonged disproportionately to Black and Hispanic owners. This data proved that Hansen's targeting of Judge Crawford was not an isolated incident or a case of poor judgment in the heat of the moment. It was part of a systematic pattern of racial profiling that he had been conducting for years. He had been essentially hunting for opportunities to harass minority residents in affluent neighborhoods. The revelation sent shockwaves through the police department's leadership. Chief Robert Barnes, a 25-year veteran who had prided himself on running a professional organization, found himself facing the worst scandal of his career. The data showed that his department had not only failed to detect this pattern of misconduct, but had actively covered it up through inadequate investigations and superficial disciplinary actions. Barnes called an emergency meeting with his command staff to discuss the crisis.